Welcome back on air with Chris Shanafel, and we are going to go ahead and kick off a very special edition of the show as we welcome on good friend of the show. If you're familiar with the program, you've heard him on here a couple of different times in the past. He's Luke Straub, writes for the Raiders Wire. He's the host of the Going Deep Raiders podcast, and it's a pleasure to welcome Luke back onto the show as the Chicago Bears and the Oakland Raiders are in London, and they'll be playing each other overseas, across the pond, I should say, this Sunday at noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Luke, appreciate you taking the time as always, man. How's everything going?
Hey, Chris, thanks for having me on. Everything's going well, man. It's been a really fun week with the Bears and the Raiders in London.
Absolutely. So the Raiders have been in London all week long. They actually traveled there following their big victory over the Indianapolis Colts, a big upset last week to a lot of NFL folks in the country. And the Bears actually just arrived to London about 8 hours ago, if that. They actually left yesterday. They arrived today. And they had a short practice today, and will I believe have the day off tomorrow. Have a short walkthrough, and then have the day off before the game kicks off Sunday noon Central Time, 6 p.m. London time. Luke, you and I have been connected since the big trade went down, and that is Khalil Mack when he was traded to the Chicago Bears a little over a year ago. Of course, the Bears acquired Khalil Mack from the Oakland Raiders for two first-round draft picks, a second-round draft pick, and then some. It seems to have worked out in the Bears' favor, no doubt about it. Khalil Mack has been the Khalil Mack that we are all used to seeing. He wreaked havoc. I believe the stat is he has 17 sacks as a Chicago Bear, and the Oakland Raiders have 18 sacks as a team since getting rid of Khalil Mack. But on the flip side, it does look like there was some bright spots for the Raiders in this trade as well. Obviously, last year's first round draft pick ended up turning into running back Josh Jacobs out of Alabama, who, as of right now, 4 weeks in, seems to be the offensive rookie of the year. He's gotten off to a great start to his very young NFL career. And we'll see what next year's draft picks turn into. But before that, of course, we got the rest of the season to play. And before that, we got this football game to play this Sunday. But just looking back on that trade, I mean, Luke, I don't know about you, but I think the entire city of Chicago would agree with me in saying that they still cannot believe that Khalil Mack is in the navy blue and orange and playing for the beloved. But looking at it from the other point of view, the Oakland point of view, Luke, how has this kind of panned out there in Oakland as time has gone
Well, I don't really know what trade you're talking about, Chris. I've forgotten about it.
on?
And it's something that I'm joking, of course, and it's something that we've actually happily put in our rearview mirror. And this game is like the reckoning. It's all coming back to us full circle, and we, as Raiders fans and followers, have got to watch this guy that the Raiders traded, and it's still unbelievable. And we're over here, we're watching John Gruden, we're watching Mike Mayock. There's optimism. They made it through the Antonio Brown thing. They're 2-2. That game against the Colts, I considered it an upset as well. Josh Jacobs, there's lots of positives. That's a huge positive. Josh Jacobs has looked really really good. Was voted by some ESPN writers as a top rookie in the league thus far. It's early. There's a lot of positives going on. Derek Carr is rounded into shape a little bit, or finding some consistency, I'll say. And during this whole time, and plus we have the draft pick coming up next year, as you mentioned, Chris. But during this whole time, it's kind of like Khalil Mack has been kind of out of sight, out of mind. And there's a lot, but right now it's squarely in the Raiders' face. Something that I don't like to think about because the man is unbelievable, and it's kind of like time heals some wounds a little bit, and that wound is healed quite a bit. When Khalil Mack was traded, it hurt the franchise. It made him look silly, and especially on that opening night when Khalil Mack wrecked shop against the Packers. It really kind of sunk the Raiders' season. And in fact, Amari Cooper said they were all in the same hotel room watching the game, and they were all very disheartened by it. So, but the wound has been healing. But here's the thing about this game, Chris, is that wound could be kind of open back up again if the Raiders don't show well in this game. They at least have got to show well and display that they've recovered as a franchise, at least begun to recover as a franchise since that trade. So that's kind of where we're at over here right now. We know that Khalil Mack is a generational talent, and he's gone. And he could have been a Raider, and he's not. I think it was some front office issues going on right there, as far as a little bit of disorganization, as far as what they wanted to do. John Gruden said he never wanted to trade Khalil Mack. A lot of good that does now. He said that the other day, but they've got to show that they're moving past it, because boy, he's a heck of a player, and that's an understatement.
Luke, I'm sure you've been asked this hundreds of times, if not even more. I know I've asked you this a little over a year ago when we first had you on the show, when this trade first went down. But as time has gone on, maybe your answer has changed, maybe it hasn't. Do you believe Khalil Mack wanted to be an Oakland Raider? Do you believe he truly wanted to play his entire career in Oakland? I know he said he met with the media earlier this week, and he said that that was the plan. He at least he spoke, and he said that that was the entire plan. He wanted to play his entire career out with the Oakland Raiders, the team that drafted him years ago. Do you believe that Khalil Mack wanted to be a Raider? Did he kind of force his way out of Oakland and into Chicago?
Well, I believe he wanted to be a Raider, but it's not really like really what he really believed. What happened was he was going to get paid, and what he really wanted to do was get paid his just dues, what he had earned, and what he had earned at that point was to become the highest paid defender in the league. And I think that he would assume, I think we all assumed that the Raiders would make that happen and adhere to his demands, whatever they were. They were not completely unreasonable considering his skills. So I think more than Khalil Mack wanting to be a Raider, he wanted to be the highest paid defender in the NFL, and he logically assumed the Raiders would make that happen. And there's no reason to think that he would. There's no reason for him to believe that that would not be the case. I think that and that's why I think I think that's why he adjusted so well to being traded to Chicago. It wasn't so much his loyalty and love for the Raiders, even though there is some of that, especially when you consider Derek Carr. And you heard Khalil Mack talk about Carr, I'm sure, and their adulation for each other. But it was more like Khalil Mack just expected the deal to get done, and it didn't. And he's a real pro, and he was able to turn the page and dominate with the Bears.
And dominate he has. Of course, the Bears locked him up to a 6-year deal worth $141 million, $90 million guaranteed. And after he inked that deal, he did become the NFL's highest paid defensive player in league history. Of course, the Bears gave up quite a few assets to acquire Mack, but seems like that trade might just pan out on both sides. I know that's what Derek Carr said the other day, that maybe there isn't a true winner in this trade, and that maybe both teams can walk away as a winner. As of right now, though, I think the favor still probably is in the Bears' corner. As of right now, we'll see what Oakland does with those future draft picks. Obviously, as of right now, they have Josh Jacobs, a pretty good one to show for it as of right now. Looking at what Khalil Mack has done with the Chicago Bears since he's arrived here in Chicago, Luke. Last season, he had 12 and a half sacks, 10 tackles for loss, a defensive touchdown, 6 forced fumbles, an interception. So far this year, he has 4.5 sacks and 4 forced fumbles. So he's on pace for 18 sacks, 16 forced fumbles. Obviously, still very early on in the season, but I love looking at it in that view, on pace for, just 4 games into the season. Is he going to have 16 forced fumbles? Probably not, very unlikely, but I'll tell you what, I will not put anything out of reach when talking about this superstar defensive player, Khalil Mack, that is. Luke, a lot of people are looking at this Bears-Raiders game being played across the pond in London as the Khalil Mack revenge game. We'll see what Khalil Mack does now with some extra added motivation. I mean, I've seen this guy, and you have as well, more than I have probably, Luke. But we've seen this guy wreck games, absolutely wreck games against teams that weren't really a second thought to him. A Minnesota Vikings or. Green Bay Packers. While that means a lot to the Bears rivalry, while that means a lot to the Bears playing in these NFC North divisional games, even Max said himself earlier in this week that he's been looking forward to this game for quite a while. He's had this one marked on his calendar. I can't even imagine what Khalil Mack will look like on a football field with any more motivation than he already plays with already that we've seen in his career.
Man, you know what, Chris? When I saw that tweet, I think it was from Vic Tafur, a beat writer for the Raiders, for the Athletic actually, and I think Khalil told that to Deion Sanders, I think, right? He had
Correct.
and I saw Vic tweeted that out, and boy, it gave me like some kind of weird kind of feeling, Chris. I was like, man, Khalil Mack, the even keeled one, the one that is this Mr. Steady Eddie, not never gives too much to the media and just really lets his play do the talking. I couldn't believe I mean, I could believe, but just to see that reported and know that he said that, it really kind of, I don't know if chills down the spine is the right way to put it, but it was like, eyes bulging out of my sockets kind of thing. It was like, man, that's not good. That's not good for the Raiders. And it was like, human nature being what it is. I heard some more Khalil Mack's comments to some of the Chicago media, not Deion Sanders, and seemed like he was kind of straddling the line, Chris, between like, knowing that it was an emotional game, it's still trying to be his steady Eddie self, but it's going to be emotional for him out there. He's going to see his buddy Derek Carr, who they had literally planned to build a franchise together, to build up a franchise together, and he's going to see Derek Carr across there, and he's going to see Trent Brown, who, and I don't know if Khalil Mack cares, but Trent Brown is the highest paid offensive lineman in NFL history, and here the Raiders are saying that, hey, Khalil, we can't pay you. So I don't know if Khalil's got that marked on his calendar too, but just to have a player like that have extra motivation against the team is boy. I mean, it's a must-watch television. I'm really looking forward to seeing what he can do and seeing if the Raiders can hold him off at all.
I know the Raiders have allowed 8 quarterback sacks on quarterback Derek Carr so far this season, and last year that was a big part in this team's struggles. What was the young, struggling offensive line? Obviously, they did make some moves in free agency to shore up that offensive line. But how improved, if at all, is that offensive line looking from last year to this year, Luke? And this Bears defensive line, while we are just focusing on Khalil Mack, it's the Khalil Mack revenge game. This Bears defensive line has more than a few different players that can make a name for themselves in this game. Leonard Floyd, Eddie Goldman, Akeem Hicks actually practiced today. He missed last week's game with a knee injury, but he practiced today and is there in London with the team, so he'll be a game-time decision. But while Khalil Mack will be the focus on the defense side of the football, there's more than a few players that could make some plays against this Oakland Raiders offense.
Yeah, the offensive line is improved, and I'm not quite sure how much yet. The Raiders have really put an emphasis on quick passes, which goes with the West Coast offense that John Gruden likes to run. Derek Carr is very skilled at that. But I will say that Colton Miller, left tackle, first round pick from last year out of UCLA, who really struggled last year in London against Frank Clark, who was playing for the Seahawks at that time. Boy, did he struggle, Chris. I mean, he got knocked backwards so hard, he almost sacked Derek Carr himself. It was a really bad game for him. But he has shown improvement, so that there's improvement there, and he's a left tackle. He's a young left tackle. That's crucial for the Raiders this year and their future success, even going into Vegas, a number 1 pick at left tackle. So he's improved. Richie Incognito has played some very good games. He's played a couple games for the Raiders. He popped up on the injury list just today. So that's something to look at. The Raiders really would have to bring up a guy from the practice squad to fill his spot. So that's an improved spot. But and really it's kind of like from last year, it's kind of a wash. They had Kelechi Osemele last season at the left guard spot. Rodney Hudson at center, he's a rock. He's really good. Right guard is a little bit of a problem. Gabe Jackson is out. He's a close to an All Pro Pro Bowl player, and then Trent Brown on the right side is definitely an improvement. Overall, they're improved, but those guards are a soft spot, and and in one-on-one battles, Derek Carr is going to want to get rid of the ball quickly against any team. Even the Colts is what they had to do against the Colts. So it's improved, but boy, this is going to be quite the test, as we know. And Derek Carr and John Gruden have got to have something planned to keep them at bay. It can't just be the offensive line that does it on their own.
And, looking at the Oakland Raiders injury report, Luke, two names that really pop out is Tyrell Williams, the team's number one wide receiver, acquired, of course, by way of the Los Angeles Chargers in free agency, and defensive end Benson Mayowa, the team's leading sack defensive end with 3.5 sacks on the season. Those two have been on the injury report. I believe they're both listed as questionable. Any update on those two guys? And let's say if they cannot go, how big of an impact could that have on this team?
Well, both could have quite an impact, Chris. And I'm going to start with Tyrell Williams because it has the potential for the largest impact. He's caught a touchdown in every one of the Raiders' 4 games thus far. The Raiders receiver core is he's got to play, or else they've really got nothing, or they've got very few receivers. Tyrell Williams is on the injury report. J.J. Nelson has also barely played this year. He has 4 catches. If those two guys don't suit up, and I'm still optimistic about Williams. I was kind of hoping he would get limited practice today, Chris, but he didn't practice at all in London, so I can't really be that optimistic. But still, a little bit of me thinks he's going to play. But right now, he didn't practice at all, so I have to be pessimistic. And if he doesn't play, if J.J. Nelson doesn't play, you're looking at Hunter Renfrow, Trevor Davis, a guy the Raiders just signed who actually had a 60-yard touchdown as a runner last week, but he's a special teams guy, fast, and also Keelan Doss, star of Hard Knocks. The Raiders would roll in to London into that game with 3 receivers. So that would be a huge impact if Tyrell Williams doesn't play. Definitely keep an eye on that. Benson Mayowa, he actually didn't suit up last week. Very strange. It was a combination of injury and the Raiders wanted to get some more inside rushers in there. But that would be an impact because Cleveland Farrell is another guy on the injury list, Chris. Rookie out of course, Clemson, number 4 overall pick. He's got a concussion. He's on the concussion protocol. So, one of those guys really would be a big help to suit up. They play the same position, and not only that, but they kind of have the same role, kind of the same style. So those could be huge impacts, Chris. And I'm really definitely I'll be waking up early Sunday to check those inactives. That's for certain.
And of course, we're always even when Tyrell Williams is playing the Chicago Bears, we're always rooting for the former guest of the show, Tyrell Williams. Got to add that in there, former undrafted free agent, making it big. Speaking of former guests of the show, Luke, guys that have had an impact so far early in the season with the Oakland Raiders, Maxx Crosby, the rookie out of Eastern Michigan University, defensive end, had a spectacular game against the Indianapolis Colts this past week, and kind of really showed that he could be a key piece. Obviously playing on that D line, there's no way to replace a player like Khalil Mack, but if you could add players that can do a little bit of everything, you're certainly moving forward and moving in the right direction. And I think, again, you can't replace a Khalil Mack, but I think the Raiders found something in Maxx Crosby. Not saying he's going to be one of these top-level superstar defensive players, but there certainly seems to be something with what John Gruden calls Mad Maxx Crosby, one of the stars of Hard Knocks. How exciting has it been to watch Maxx Crosby again? Especially with the Oakland Raiders being on Hard Knocks, he was one of those featured players and a guy that even throughout the draft process, a lot of people were really saying how this guy has a lot of potential. It's just on if the right coaching staff gets their hands on him and whether or not that potential is actually reached. And it looks like he may have fell into a pretty good situation there in Oakland.
Well, first of all, Chris, I'm kind of blown away. I think the Raiders definitely need to draft more players and acquire more players that have been on your show. Those are two fantastic guys, fantastic players on the Raiders roster. And Max Crosby had a breakout game last week. He, of course, I think you mentioned Hard Knocks. Most of us saw him break his hand, and he really didn't get that many snaps. And that was one of the reasons. Another reason Benson Mayowa didn't suit up last week was because the Raiders wanted to get Max Crosby some more time, and it really paid off. It was a pure joy to watch him, Chris. I got to say, it was my first real look at the guy, and of course, coming out of Eastern Michigan, a smaller school, there was word coming out actually from Gruden and Mayock that he needed to gain weight and gain strength. He came into camp at 255 pounds. I'm like, okay, we got something going on here. And I've been waiting to see him come in, and he had a spectacular game. A couple passes batted down to the line of scrimmage. He had a huge forced fumble to keep the momentum with the Raiders. And I believe he punched that ball out with the same hand that was broken in the preseason, showing a lot of grit. And I really like Max Crosby. And you mentioned about replacing Khalil Mack, and yeah, it's tough to put the pressure on a young player like Max Crosby and the rest of the defense when they're like number 27 in the league in sacks. But that's part of kind of what I talked about at the beginning when I was talking on this segment here, Chris, is Raiders have got to show that they've at least begun to turn the page, and that includes the defense, that includes the pass rush. And he's definitely Max Crosby, one of my players to watch. He was a lot of fun to watch, a lot of high energy play. That fumble strip was a high energy play. He's got the physical tools, it seems, which is very, very encouraging. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what he has in store for the Bears and looking to see if he can continue the momentum he started last week. He looked great.
Couple more questions with Luke Straub. He writes for the Raiders Wire, host of the Going Deep Raiders podcast. You guys can follow him on Twitter at Luke J. Straub. That's your Twitter handle, right? Right, Luke? It's Luke J.
That's right.
Straub. Okay, correct. Okay, great. Yeah, must follow, especially for all things Raiders related, and if you're a basketball fan, Warriors related as well. Luke J. Straub. Luke, couple more questions for you. We spent a lot of time talking about Khalil Mack and the Khalil Mack revenge game. Let's not forget, it's also the Eddie Pinheiro revenge game. Obviously, the Chicago Bears have had a lot of struggles with the kicker position the last few years, and obviously it was maximized in the playoffs last year with Cody Parkey double doinking the 43-yard field goal to lose the game by a couple of points to the Philadelphia Eagles at home at Soldier Field in Chicago. Flip the page, going back to rookie minicamp, the Bears at one point had 9 kickers competing for the kicking job. It dwindled down to 2 in Bourbonnais at training camp, and Eddie Pinheiro came out as the winner of that kicking competition. And this was a player that in the offseason they acquired from the Oakland Raiders for a 7th-round draft pick. And it seems like the Bears may have found their guy in Eddie Pinheiro. He already hit a game-winning field goal week 2 against the Denver Broncos on the road. And last week he was 3 for 3 against the Minnesota Vikings in a 16-6 victory for the Bears. This is a guy I remember coming out of college, coming out of the University of Florida, that I remember when the Raiders signed him as an undrafted free agent. John Gruden was really high on Eddie Pinheiro, and it almost seemed as if that this would be the Raiders kicker for the future. They were still trying to find that guy to replace Sebastian Janikowski, and all signs pointed to maybe Eddie Pinheiro being that guy. Well, instead, he spent all of last season on IR. They end up picking up Daniel Carlson, the former 5th-round pick by the Minnesota Vikings. He ends up having a pretty solid, actually a pretty good rookie season after the early struggles with Minnesota. And they end up trading Eddie Pinheiro to the Chicago Bears for a 7th-round draft pick. Eddie Pinheiro revenge game. Luke, I mean, what was your take on Eddie Pinheiro? Was that did I kind of sell that the right way? Did it kind of seem like when they signed this kid last year out of the University of Florida as an undrafted free agent that this would be the Raiders kicker of the future? And what exactly happened? I mean, again, this was a guy that
Mhm.
John Gruden was very high on. At least it seemed like from the outside looking in. Why exactly did they feel comfortable enough? I mean, having a kicker, as we've seen last year here in Chicago, is very crucial in this game of football. Why did they feel comfortable moving on from Eddie Pinheiro after just a year in which he spent on IR?
Well, yeah, he was definitely supposed to be the guy, Chris, for certain. In fact, the Raiders, you mentioned he was an undrafted free agent. The Raiders, I forget the exact dollar amount, but they paid top dollar for Eddie Pinheiro. They went over and above the normal amount you would pay. They really liked him, really liked his leg, strong leg, and not only that, the Raiders had the also drafted, actually drafted in the fifth round. That was a terrible pick because he's not on a team, but they drafted the punter from the University of Florida that played with Eddie Pinheiro. So we're over here thinking it's going to be like a former Florida Gator battery with the kicker and the punter, and that was kind of the story. We all figured that's how it was going to come to fruition. And I do believe that Eddie Pinheiro did have a legit injury, and I think that's what derailed him. And that's kind of how it went. And it maybe perhaps if the Raiders didn't luck out, I mean they really lucked out with Daniel Carlson. I feel pretty certain that the Raiders would have brought Eddie Pinheiro back this year for camp, or would have tried to rush him back after Week 8 last season to get Eddie Pinheiro back in the team because they were legitimately high on him. In fact, Chris, I don't think I've ever seen Eddie Pinheiro on the NFL, or I don't think I ever saw him in a Raiders uniform kick in a preseason game or anything like that. So I'm really looking forward to seeing him. Old Eddie Pinheiro. I wrote a ton of articles for the Raiders Wire about that guy. I feel like he was definitely more of a former Raider than he was because I covered him a lot. And hey, you know what? It's human nature, Chris. He's gonna have, yeah, I'm with it. Eddie Pinheiro revenge game. He's gonna look. He's gonna look across. He's gonna look across there. He's gonna see Daniel Carlson. He's gonna say, "Oh, you think that guy's okay? No, check this leg out. Here's Eddie Pinheiro." And he's probably gonna say, "I still got your money, Raiders." And here we are.
Yeah, so much for that Khalil Mack revenge game. It's all about the Eddie Pinheiro revenge
Yeah,
game.
I'm in.
Uh,
I'm into it.
Prediction: he'll go 4 for 4 from the field, and we'll go with a long of 59-yard field goal. How about that for a prediction? Literally looking through the Oakland Raiders roster right now, trying to think if they have any former Bears on the team. I didn't think so, and it doesn't look like it as I'm coming to the end of the roster here. So yeah, you got the Khalil Mack revenge game. You got the Eddie Pinheiro revenge game. Last question before we let you go, Luke, and let's just get a prediction from you. How do you see this game going playing out? They are at a neutral site in London across the pond. Although I do think this does count as one of the Oakland Raiders' home games. Um, but again, a neutral site. Oh, actually, excuse me, Mike Glennon, the Mike Glennon
Oh,
revenge game we
I'm
could
happy.
possibly
Yeah.
have. Maybe Khalil Mack gets after Derek Carr a little too much. Maybe the game gets out of reach, and maybe they end up throwing Mike Glennon out there, and maybe he pulls a comeback for the Oakland Raiders. No, but Luke, I mean, what? How are you expecting this game to play out? And I'll ask you this: if the Oakland Raiders end up pulling this one out, if the Oakland Raiders get the victory over the Chicago Bears, how in the hell would that happen?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it's yeah. I do want to mention first of all, it could really be a field goal fest, and I really like that you brought up the kickers for that reason also. In addition to the and in addition to the revenge, that definitely could come down to kickers. But if the Raiders are going to keep this close, and whether it's touchdowns or field goals, keep it close. They're going to have to first of all talk about the Raiders' defense. They're going to have to somehow disrupt Chase Daniel and disrupt the timing of that offense. And defensive coordinator Paul Gunther is going to have to use his scheme to get that done. That's really why Coach Gruden brought the scheme in, brought Gunther in. It's that kind of like that double mug uh, blitz look up the middle that the Vikings do, that the Bengals did with Gunther, where you kind of confuse the quarterback. And I know Daniel's a veteran, but it's a very confusing defensive scheme. The Raiders are going to have to bring either confuse the quarterback by releasing it into the defense and not blitzing, faking the blitz essentially, or they're gonna have to maybe bring some secondary players, maybe some Marcus Joyner. They have to disrupt that offense somehow. Uh, and with the Raiders on offense, there's no really beating Khalil Mack. In a one-on-one battle, you cannot go mano a mano against this guy. You have got to keep him off balance. You got to make sure that he doesn't know what's coming. I think what the Raiders did last week, they have to try to repeat again. Short, quick passes to open up the game, and then follow that up with some power runs. And also, they should really get the ball to Josh Jacobs in the passing game. Get him some open space out there. He's not going to find much open space between the tackles. Find some way to get outside the tackles. Use Josh Jacobs' skills in the open field. He's got a lot of bulk. He's got a lot of agility. He's got awareness even at an early age. So, but mostly keep those defenders off balance, Chris. Because if the Raiders don't, Khalil Mack's is going to run right over in some instances, in enough instances to sink the Raiders' hopes. So yeah, definitely disrupt on defense, keep the Bears' defense off balance, and rely on Derek Carr's short, quick passes and Josh Jacobs just getting the ball in open space and maybe mix in some jet sweeps that worked last week for the Raiders on a 60-yard touchdown, and it would be worth it just this week just to get the Bears further off balance. And if they can do that, they might and play mistake-free football. That's a must. Get a turnover or two. That almost goes without saying. But if they can do that, they might be able to pull out a win. At least keep it close and keep the good vibes the Raiders have going into the bye week and into the game after that.
Of course, both teams will be entering their bye week after this game, seeing as they are both playing in London. Again, the 2-2 Oakland Raiders playing the 3-1 Chicago Bears. You guys can follow Luke on Twitter at Luke J. Straub. He writes for the Raiders Wire. He's the host of the Going Deep Raiders podcast. One final thing before I let you go, Luke. Your take on the Vontaze Burfict suspension. The NFL announced that he has been suspended for the remainder of the season. All signs point to Vontaze Burfict and his agent appealing this suspension. Maybe it'll get reduced down, maybe it won't. One last thing for you, Luke. Your overall take on this. Was this the right decision by the NFL to suspend Vontaze Burfict for the remainder of the season for that hit that he placed last week against Jack Doyle of the Indianapolis Colts? Of course, Vontaze Burfict has a reputation of making these dirty hits, and this was another one of those helmet-to-helmet hits. Did this? Would you say that this is justified by the NFL for making this decision of suspending Vontaze Burfict for the remainder of the season? Because I know a lot of the players in that Raiders locker room think otherwise. They think this was not the right decision. Tahir Whitehead has spoken out publicly. Derek Carr has spoken out publicly. How do you feel about this decision by the NFL?
Well, this one, Chris, definitely has some layers to it. I'm going to get to the national story as quick as possible, but I do want to mention that, yes, of course, the Raiders players have their guys back. Vontaze Burfict, remarkably, was voted a captain, and I say remarkably because of his past. But he was brought in to organize a defense, that complicated Paul Guenther defense I mentioned. So, yes, the players, they're going to feel that way, of course. And then you have the Raiders front office. And, Chris, coming into this season, I looked at the first depth chart of the season, which we all love to do. Vontaze Burfict was the only middle linebacker listed. Okay, that's incredible. And the Raiders really shot themselves in the foot with this as far as the front office. You had to know that there was a good chance of this happening. It's happened before numerous times as far as missing games for Vontaze Burfict. So there's that with the Raiders. But with the big picture thing, I don't know what else I would expect the NFL to do. Vontaze Burfict served it up for him on a silver platter. The NFL is trying to change their game, and Vontaze Burfict just made himself the poster boy for that by making that hit. He could have done almost anything else on that play, but what he chose to do was lead with the crown of his helmet and hit Doyle in the crown of his helmet. And even though Doyle said it was no big deal, that's what the NFL is doing. I think we're all very aware of that, very much too well aware of that. And Vontaze Burfict either wasn't aware or didn't care. And whether the players like it or not, or we all have our different opinion on it, I think it's a matter of fact that the NFL is trying to erase that from the game. And Vontaze Burfict made it too easy for him. And while I know it hurts the Raiders, I'm not surprised by it one bit. And like I mentioned with the front office, I don't feel sorry for the team at all. that this is their situation, that they made the bet on this one. So that's the way I see it, Chris. And I really do. The one thing I will say about it is I wish Vontaze was well aware of the situation as we all are, and could have avoided that and saved the Raiders some trouble.
Again, that's the voice of Luke Straub. He writes for the Raiders Wire, host of the Going Deep Raiders podcast. Follow him on Twitter at Luke J. Straub. Luke, I feel like this conversation could last another couple of hours, if not days. Really appreciate you taking the time this evening. Again, the Bears take on the Oakland Raiders across the pond in London this Sunday, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern. Luke, really appreciate your time, man. Please let the listeners know where they can check out your work at.
Oh yeah, of course. Check out my work at the Raiders Wire, RaidersWire.com, and everyone check out the podcast. You can find that at BigHeadsMedia.com. You can find that at GoingDeep.Transistor.fm, also Spotify and YouTube.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Luke. Really appreciate it, and enjoy the game this Sunday.
Thanks so much, Chris. I had a blast. And yeah, have fun at the game, man. Let's get it on.